The world is certainly feeling up for grabs these days. I'm getting a lot of email asking. The world is certainly feeling up for grabs these days. I'm getting a lot of email asking me to comment on North Korea, the Nazi rallies, the Charlottesville murder, the Boston protests, Stephen Bannon's departure. And what I want to challenge is that anyone, me included, should necessarily have an immediate response to any of this. There's really a difference between having a considered response and just reacting in the moment. Sometimes we can react in the moment and react appropriately, but for the most part, we react on impulse. We react from our reptile brain. We react when we need an immediate fight or flight answer to a threat. What we really need now are something more like responses, where we take the time to consider the entire system that we're dealing with and think, how do I really want to respond to this? What is the best next move that I can make? When you look at Trump himself, the reason why he gets in so much trouble is because for the most part he's reacting. He's reacting off the cuff and then having to commit to that direction. I mean, that's why when we then react to him, we end up going further off, further in there, in a kind of a call and response, where our responses are not real responses. They're just impulses. I understand you need a fast response, a reaction even, if a Nazi is about to punch you or your friend in the face. But each and every one of us doesn't have to know how we feel about everything that's happening right away. It's as if the constant churn of news media is demanding that we each manufacture a coherent set of responses in sync with every new crisis. Who says so? And who really cares what any of us thinks about every single issue anyway? The speed at which all this stuff is being broadcast has much less to do with world events than the way that entertainment corporations competing for eyeballs work in an attention economy. And the reality show will only get more and more frenetic as it proves to be a profit center for these conglomerates and the entertainment platforms that they own. When we try to maintain that pace, our responses devolve into mere reactions. And it's harder to consider what to do when we think it's incumbent upon us to do something right now. So my first considered response is, don't feed the trolls. We're living in a digital media environment. And what happens in the comment sections of Twitter or Instagram ends up trickling out and happening in the world. So we can recreate the mindless chaos of the net in real life and let our behaviors migrate from one place to the other. But I'm arguing we really shouldn't. In digital spaces, we can't help but react. In real life, we have the buffers enabling us to choose to respond instead. So just because some people say they're gonna go stand somewhere and shout some awful thing about blacks or Jews or some praising thing about Nazis, does that mean we've got to run out there and be with them and contradict them? Does every stupid thing someone says require us to marshal our limited time and resources and give them a response? For that matter, should we all be listening to Rush Limbaugh and the Hannity Report every day and responding with essays to that stuff? Do we want to honor it to that extent? I'm not sure. When I look at the difference between what happened in Charlottesville and what happened in Boston, I feel like I'm seeing the difference between people reacting to horror and people responding to horror. In Charlottesville, members of Antifa, the anti-fascist network, were willing to put their bodies on the line to repel the Nazis and protect others. They met violent intentions with at least the willingness to respond in kind if necessary, and violence ensued. Whether the Nazi with the car would have run people over if everybody had been committed to nonviolent Gandhi-style passivity, we'll never know. I do know that two of my progressive neighbors committed to purchasing firearms after the rally, which is not encouraging to me. That, again, looks like a reaction and not a response. The Boston protests, on the other hand, consisted of a couple of dozen supremacists and some tens of thousands of anti-fascists committed to humiliating the Nazis with their mere presence. Their calm mockery reminded me of that town in Germany. It's an unwilling host to an annual Nazi rally, and they chose to respond by having the whole town show up as clowns when the Nazis march. They even mark the street. They make it look like a walkathon, or a racetrack walkathon, and they raise money based on how far the Nazis march. And they have flags at the end, and they thank the marchers, and they hold up signs and say, "Oh, look, you Nazis, look how much you've just raised for our Nazi deprogramming charity," where they help deprogram young people who became Nazis. Is Antifa wrong to be maintaining violence in its toolkit? Not necessarily. My relatives were murdered in the pogroms in Russia, and many Jews who survived blamed my relatives for their passivity. They preferred the tactics of the Warsaw Ghetto, where the people who lived there fought against the incoming Nazis in that case. And nobody ever doubted which side was more righteous. There were no false equivalencies cast between the Nazis and the defending inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto, just as there really can't be any equivalencies drawn between violent Nazis and defending Antifa who are willing to be violent if they're being attacked in order to stop their skull from getting bashed in. The power of an Antifa, arms and all, would be to demonstrate some truly elegant Aikido, though, in some extremely complicated situations. They need to show how having kung fu on the side of the people can help preserve our dignity along with our skulls. The real question is whether there's a way to do nonviolent protest without martyring oneself to the cause. Do we have to be willing to get run over in order to make our case? I don't know. Statistically, nonviolent protest has earned more big wins than those that involve any sort of violence. But when we see the circle of history seemingly bringing us back to where we were, maybe where we've always been, it's certainly worth considering a new response.